Hello and welcome to Spirit of Success. My name is Linda Ruland and my guest today is Joe Sharp. Joe is an experienced computer scientist who has brought lots of innovations to the world in his career. Hi Joe and welcome to Spirit of Success.
Well, thank you. The three things that I'm the most interested in having done are an operating system scheduler, a design automation system to build computers, and to build a part of the GE CAT scanner. So that's really all I've done with my life.
If we could all have so little to have done within our lives, the world would be an extremely different place today. So Joe, some of the questions I have for you today relate to an experience that you had with an individual most of us know, Steve Jobs. You had a brush with Steve Jobs, working with him on a project. Can you tell me what brought you and Steve Jobs together?
I wanted to get involved in the PC field, and Steve kept showing up at our meetings, at our amateur meetings with Wozniak, Steve Wozniak. But the first real contact I had with him personally was at the first West Coast Computer Fair in 1977. There were about 14 computers being demonstrated, and the Apple II was introduced at that show. And it was distinctive. It was beautiful, and it did a lot of things that the other machines weren't doing yet. So I went to Steve and said, "You have a very nice machine here, but what are you going to do for the competition?" He said, "What competition?" I said, "Well, there's 13 other computers being shown here. What are you going to do about them?" "Those aren't my competition. My competition is IBM and the Japanese." This braggadocio completely turned me off. I just turned my head and walked away, because neither IBM or any Japanese firm was in the computer field. It took me a while to realize that he had a vision beyond mine of where the field was going and who was going to be in it. But then I went back to him and I said, "You know, you have an awfully nice machine here. Have you got a manual for it yet?" Now, I was a professor of computer science at Berkeley, and I had taught beginners how to program PCs. And I said, "I could produce a manual for you in about a month that would be quite effective in using the machine." "Well," he said, "that doesn't sound like a bad idea. I'll get you an Apple II and we'll see what you can do." I worked very hard that month, and it was quite difficult. It kept me up quite late in order to produce a draft of a complete manual with demonstration programs running on the Apple II. I brought it back to him at the end of the month, and he said, "Let me look at it. Come back tomorrow." Well, I came back tomorrow. He picked up my draft, and he walked over to the garbage can and threw it in. And he said, "This is just shit." And I have to realize that Steve was a 22-year-old, completely uninformed programmer, and I was a professor of computer science at Berkeley. I was just infuriated, so I turned away and walked away. About 2 weeks later, he phoned me and said, "You know, Joe, there's some interesting developments happening at Apple. Maybe you'd like to come and see them." I said, "I'll think about it." And of course, I didn't go. So that was my whole experience with Steve Jobs. And it took a psychotherapist to explain to me that he wasn't just a cruel monster trying to hurt people. She explained to me that he probably wasn't even trying to hurt you. He didn't even know he was doing it. He was so self-centered. That was just his way of saying goodbye. So that's the end of my story about Steve Jobs.
Seems like it was the end and potentially a beginning there, almost as if he was inviting you in to perhaps be a member of his team in one way or another. Maybe for all we know, he was apologizing. But that's the interesting thing about somebody like Steve Jobs. He doesn't fall into what we would classify, from what you describe, as somebody who is like our neighbor on the street. He had some very peculiar personality traits. Do you think, with what you've experienced through him and through where you've seen his leadership evolve in the media, that those characteristics are what made him a leader?
That's been an interesting question that I have thought a lot about. Because on one hand, he wasn't very creative. Nothing he did was new. He copied the Mac from the Xerox machine. Other companies had tried to make a telephone and an iPad. So all he did was essentially to implement ideas that belonged to other people. But his talent was to take a group of very talented employees and drive them almost crazy with desire and with hard work. He could drive somebody nuts, but in the meantime, he would have produced one of the most remarkable pieces of equipment that had ever been created.
So what you're saying is the talent didn't come from Steve. The talent came from the people that Steve surrounded himself with, and he had the ability to bring the talent out of them.
It's even more than that. I agree. Of course, I would say exactly what you said, Linda, but more than that. He not only could use their ideas and take their talent, but he knew what was worth doing. He had an instinct for good quality work. He could see quality even when no one else could. So he had that gift.
Okay, so in some cases, it sounds like he saw that quality before it was even something to look at or examine. It was something already in his imagination or in his mind. Is that
Yes,
what you described?
I believe that.
Okay. All right. And somehow then, he was able to convey that vision, that abstract vision, to a team of people. How do you suppose that worked?
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. He had a gift for presenting ideas. In fact, books have been written to try and teach the techniques he used for presentation. They were so remarkable and so effective. He was a very effective presenter, probably one of the most, in fact, I would say that his two main talents were to recognize things worth doing and to present ideas in ways that people could just not resist them.
Now, you were saying that in so many ways he was somebody who would make people crazy. They didn't like working with him. You didn't like working with him. And yet, the man has become a legend. What do you suppose made Steve Jobs legendary?
Well, no, that's a more complicated issue because I believe there were certain men in our history of technology mainly who seemed legendary. The Wright brothers, Terman at Stanford, the Bell Labs people, and Steve. Each of them were created by a new technology that they learned how to exploit. And it was a circumstance that essentially made Steve. It wasn't just that he was so original and talented. He came at the right moment. It was the time that was important, in my mind, more so than even his own gifts.
So there's a saying that goes, when the student is ready, the teacher will arrive or will appear. It sounds to me like there might be a correlation here that when the world is ready, the leader will appear.
I couldn't agree more, except I wouldn't say when the world is ready. I would say when the technology is ready.
Technology.
Because it's always been, even when Carnegie came and created the steel industry, the technology was there. It's just that he learned how to use it effectively. Even when Standard Oil found oil in Arabia, they essentially were created by the circumstance at the time. And I guess in the case of oil, that wasn't technology, that was exploration. But in each case, when you think of someone having made a major impact, you should ask yourself what was going on at the same time in, as you say, the world, or at least in the technology.
Okay. All right. When dealing with somebody like Jobs or Carnegie, as you describe, you said the technology is ready and the leader that they are
Appears.
shows up. Now, how do they operate from your perspective? Do they focus on one or two things within that industry, or is it a bigger picture?
Well, there's a number of different cases which would cover everything you've mentioned. Leonardo da Vinci covered a large number of fields, and Galileo did also. But in these newer cases, it was more specialized. Steve Jobs didn't create art and didn't deal with the media, except to produce product, to sell products. So there's different types of individuals.
Okay, so each has his or her own technique.
Talents.
Talents.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're exploring their talents and exploiting the talents of those with whom they associate or have gathered together. Now, most of us are not Steve Jobs in terms of our scope, though some of us may be. But all of us have some kind of a world that we're creating if we're entrepreneurial. We're dealing with something that we've envisioned that we need to convey to both our team and then ultimately who our consumer will be. What do you suppose we can learn from somebody with maybe our more modest talents that that these leaders have demonstrated, that have proven successful time after time?
That's an interesting question, Linda, because I've given that some thought.
Okay.
Many of us, and in fact my first wife was like this, have talents which we don't even appreciate. We do things easily that other people can't do at all. And they're so obvious and so easy for us, we don't appreciate how special our talents are. She had this gift of walking into a room and arranging it in a way that no one had ever thought of before, effortlessly. And I always ask her, what were you doing? She said, I was just straightening up. It never occurred to her that she was using a very special gift. And so in answer to your question, if you are interested in using your talents, you should try to find out what you do for fun, what you do in your spare time, what you dream about, what you do when there's nothing else to do. What is it that is so obvious and easy for you that other people can't do it? And I think you'll need help sometimes. I really think you should ask people around you, do I do anything special? Because I think you're going to be surprised and pleased. And of course, people with musical talent show that up even at age 2, or certainly at 4. And my son at age 4 already showed he did some amazing things with my computer that I hadn't taught him how to do. He just had an instinct of what to do. And that's essentially the way I would answer your question.
So focus in on, or discover what it is that you do well. Is that the case?
Yes. And what you can't help doing.
Oh, even beyond that, what you can't help doing.
You'll find people who sing or dance or build things or arrange things, and they just can't help themselves because it's so easy and so obvious that that's what has to be done. So that's how I would answer your question.
And just a comment on that is there's so many people out there running their businesses, working within their businesses, doing all the things, wearing so many hats. Would I be correct in interpreting your statement that they should probably try to offload or delegate some of those other tasks and really pursue having fun in their work?
It's funny you should say that. There's the newsman, Colston.
Okay.
He basically was winning. He had a show that people couldn't resist, and he's decided to quit it. And that's the attitude of a really creative person. the answer is, what else can I do? What am I not doing that I can do better? And I'm sure he's going to find out, and I'm sure we'll all benefit from it. So the answer is, try not to get in a rut of just doing what comes easily to you. Try and find something special that you could do even better.
That sounds exciting. And that's very rewarding, just hearing that. Because I think somewhere deep down, most of us know that, but for whatever reason, for whatever obligations we feel we may have, we seem to put it off. And sometimes I think, I don't know if you agree with me, Joe, but sometimes I think people are afraid of their own talent.
Well, I think there's another way of putting it. Your biggest hazard of being a success is your present success.
Ah, that's so true.
Your present well-paying job or your pleasant business is getting in the way of what you could do if you just go further.
Circling back to Steve Jobs, maybe that's where his success kept coming back then, because sometimes he would, well, there have been some historic events where he lost his job. He lost his position within his company, and he would come back time and time again, wouldn't he?
Good for you. I knew that was true, but I hadn't connected the things up. Yes, he often said that having been kicked out of Apple was the greatest thing that ever happened to him, because he completely changed everything he was doing, and it was better. Good point.
And that is so helpful to so many of us, because there are numerous business owners and entrepreneurs out there who have, and can attest to this, that they've started and started again. They've had more than one company. So perhaps if at whatever point you are in your business cycle that it seems like it's not exactly where you would like it to be, where it wasn't before, that it's in transition to something potentially better. Would you have any insights, Joe, as to how to take that the right direction versus really succumb to
Well, first,
the pressures?
I would like to restate it slightly differently than you did.
Okay.
Being disappointed in your present business is a good incentive to change. But I think being successful and being at top of your mark is also a hazard. The best thing you can do to someone who's at the top of his mark is to challenge him to go higher, to do more, to see something that he hadn't known, or she.
Uh-huh.
So being a success is a hazard as well as a success.
Okay. How do we overcome that hazard, Joe? That's a hard question, I know.
I think we often need help. One of the most important things that I did in my life, which was to help build the CAT scanner, it wasn't my idea to do it. A friend of mine knew I had this special skill, and they needed it, but it wasn't my job, and I had to be encouraged to do it by a guy with good perspective. I'm indebted to him for that.
I hate to say the cliche, but I think it's true in this case. Nobody does it alone, do they?
I don't think so. At least I didn't.
In your case, Joe, I have to believe that it's your listening skills, your ability to hear other people and other perspectives that helped you arrive to those kinds of innovations.
Well, I must say your questions are pretty good. And I thank you for them.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you for sharing with us. Now, you mentioned earlier that the technology was ready at the time Steve Jobs came into his place of leadership. Now, that's a few years ago already, especially when we talk technology years. What place is technology today? And what kind of leaders are we needing today? And where is technology headed in your opinion?
I was hoping you would ask that. First of all, I'd like to discuss my attitude about big data. Normally, when we go to a computer, we tell it what we want. We tell Google to look something up, or we tell our machine to follow some instructions. What's happening in big data is that the computer is analyzing the situation we're in, and it tells us what to do. Now, I'll try and pick a simple example to just illustrate the point. One indication of a failure in a business is a service that's being overloaded or that's not being used, either extreme. In either case, it's easy for an outside machine to measure the backlog of a given service and decide it's too low and therefore the service should be removed, or it's too high and we should either change the input load or build its resources up. So big data is, to my way of thinking, the most exciting thing that is happening in the computer field right now. And the idea of the computer telling people what to do, it was made fun of in the New York Times last Sunday, in which they talked about the computers running the business and the humans being used as janitors. Well, I hope we don't reach that point, but it is going to be a fact that machines are going to be telling us much more about what to do, and big data is the source of that exciting input.
And do we have leaders right now that are tackling that you're aware of, or is that just an open field for the new leader of tomorrow to show up?
I would say it's the latter.
Okay.
I would say that we're still looking for another Steve Jobs, someone who can just completely dominate that field, and I don't see anybody doing that, although I have some hope that I know who it is.
So much to look forward to, really.
Yeah.
Now, Joe, you've done a great deal of service with your career, but I have a hard time believing you're done with it. What are you working on today that is going to help us get to where we're going?
You know, you never know what you're doing until it's done. I don't know a good answer to that. I'd like to say that I'm driven by the motto that there is no cure for curiosity.
I love that motto. It's so very meaningful to me. And when you think about it, that's really summarizes well what you've talked with us today about. You said that people like Jobs were not necessarily the most creative people in the world, but what they did was they had a vision that was so clear and that they comprehended what was needed at the time, and then they had a talent that would help them become very attractive and communicate that vision to not only their people, their teams, but to the people who are going to use
Customers. Yeah.
the customers. And those are all things that we can take away for our businesses. But most importantly, it seems to me that from what you've described, Steve Jobs did what he loved to do. Is that true?
Oh, there's no question about that.
And if we focus on what we love to do and figure out what our talents are, our innate talents, not the ones that we learn, but we...
And get help from other people to find them, because we aren't going to always recognize our own talent.
And that's very, very intriguing. Joe, I thank you for your input today. I thank you for your time and for all the things you've given to us to make our lives a better place.
Well, thank you too, Linda. I've enjoyed this interview very much.
Wonderful. Joe Sharp, everybody.